The prison was abandoned, but its legacy lived on. Located deep in the woods, far from any civilization, the structure had once housed some of the most dangerous criminals in the country. But it had been shut down abruptly, and no one could say why. The rumors, however, were endless. Some claimed the prisoners had grown so violent that the guards fled in terror. Others whispered of strange happenings, disappearances, strange noises, and an energy so dark that it drove everyone away. Whatever the reason, it stood empty for years, until the ghost seekers arrived. It was a cold, overcast evening when the team of paranormal investigators rolled up to the prison gates. The place looked every bit as haunted as the stories described. The walls were covered in thick vines, the windows shattered, and the air smelled of decay. The old rusted gates creaked eerily as they pushed through, and the ground beneath them seemed to sigh under their feet, as if the earth itself was reluctant to let them in. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with an unsettling energy, the air damp and heavy. The team moved cautiously through the prison's long, narrow corridors, their footsteps echoing off the cracked concrete walls. Their cameras captured the shadows, the darkness that seemed to gather at the edges of their vision, but it was impossible to shake the feeling that something was watching them. Sarah, the lead investigator, stopped as she reached a hallway filled with old cell doors, some ajar, others locked shut. The cells were decayed, their bars rusted and chipped. She paused at one that stood out, a door at the far end of the corridor, its number completely scratched out, replaced by something darker. The black ink seemed to pulse in the low light. Sarah's hand hovered over the door, her heart pounding in her chest. Something about it felt wrong, unnatural. James, the cameraman, caught the unease in her expression. "What is it?" he asked. "Just a bad feeling," Sarah replied, her voice low. She glanced around, but the silence was suffocating. There were no sounds of wind or birds, nothing. Just the oppressive stillness. She turned the handle. It clicked open, the door creaking on its hinges. As they stepped inside, the temperature dropped dramatically. The chill wasn't normal, it was like stepping into a freezer. But it wasn't the cold that made the hairs on the back of Sarah's neck stand up. It was the whispers. Faint at first, as if they were coming from the very walls themselves, but then louder. A soft, guttural murmur that seemed to say the same thing over and over. "Get out." The sound made James' blood run cold. He aimed the camera at Sarah, but she didn't respond. She was staring at the floor, her eyes wide with terror. The floor was covered in something dark. It wasn't just dirt or grime, it was blood, thick and congealed. It spread in a pattern that looked disturbingly like handprints, as if someone had tried to crawl away, but never made it. "Sarah," James said, his voice barely a whisper. He was afraid to look away from the camera. She didn't move. Then, slowly, she lifted her eyes to meet his. Her face was pale, and her lips trembled. "We're not alone." Suddenly, the temperature plummeted further. The walls groaned as if they were shifting, and the whispers grew louder, more distinct. Then, a sharp sound, the scraping of metal against stone. One of the cell doors behind them slammed shut, echoing through the prison like a gunshot. They spun around, but nothing was there. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows at the far end of the hallway. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs distorted at unnatural angles. The figure's face was obscured by a tangle of hair, but its presence was suffocating. It didn't move, it just stood there, watching them. James raised his camera, but his hands were shaking so badly that the shot was blurry. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it took one slow, deliberate step forward, its movements jerky, like a marionette on strings. It was closer now, its breath visible in the freezing air, but it didn't seem to be breathing. Its face was still hidden, but they could feel its eyes on them, dark, empty, hungry. "Run!" Sarah screamed. She grabbed James by the arm, but as they turned to flee, the door they'd come through slammed shut behind them, trapping them in the hallway. The whispers intensified, coming from every direction now. The walls seemed to pulse with the sound, and the air grew thick, suffocating. James pounded on the door, but it wouldn't budge. The figure was behind them now, its footsteps slow and deliberate. And the prisoners, whatever they were closing in, their shadowy forms looming in the periphery. They backed up, hearts pounding in their chests, but the figure just kept coming, dragging its feet along the floor. And then, from behind them, came the sound of more doors opening. One by one, the cells began to open. The team could hear the soft scrape of bare feet across the cold floor, the shuffle of bodies moving through the dark. It was like the entire prison was waking up, every cell releasing its prisoner. But these weren't just any prisoners. They were something else, something twisted. The whispers grew louder, the voices mingling together, all of them speaking in unison. "You shouldn't have come." Panic set in. They turned and bolted down the hallway, but the darkness seemed to stretch endlessly, the shadows shifting and moving, swallowing the light. Every corner they turned, every door they passed, seemed to lead them deeper into the heart of the prison, into the blackness. It was like they were running in circles, trapped in a maze that was designed to never let them leave. And then, they reached the end. At the end of the hall, just before the staircase that led back to the upper floors, was another door. But this one wasn't old or rusted. It was pristine, gleaming in the darkness, as if waiting for them. On the door was a name, scrawled in thick, black ink. The Forgotten Cells. It was the last room they hadn't explored, the one they'd been warned about. But there was nowhere else to go. The figure was behind them now, its footsteps slow and deliberate. And the prisoners, whatever they were closing in, their shadowy forms looming in the periphery. James pushed the door open, and the room beyond was empty, except for a single, blood-stained mattress in the center of the floor. The walls were lined with fresh, deep scratch marks, some still oozing with blood. They didn't have time to think. The door slammed shut behind them with a deafening crash, and for the first time, they heard the voice that had been whispering in the darkness all along. "Welcome home." Then everything went black. Days later, the authorities found the prison, but the team was gone. No one knew what happened, and the investigation was closed. The prison was locked up again, and the world moved on. But some things can never be forgotten. And sometimes, they don't want to be. The forgotten cells still wait, locked away in the dark. And those who enter, never leave.